Good afternoon and welcome to our new studios at Atlantic Council headquarters in Washington, D.C. I'm Jason Marzek, Director of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center. Minister Guedes, thank you so much for being here to have this timely conversation on the future of Brazil's economic development and U.S. Brazil economic ties. Setting the stage for our conversation is the fact that as Brazil and the rest of the world grapple with the effects of COVID, economic recovery is a key component of overall pandemic recovery. These topics are at the forefront of World Bank and IMF annual meetings occurring just down the street here in Washington, D.C. Those meetings are critical for looking at the future of economic recovery overall across the region. Earlier this year, the OECD assessed that Brazil's economy strongly recovered toward the end of 2020, driven by an increase in household consumption and investment. At the same time, the Brazilian government has provided monetary assistance and continued social programs to support its population during these unprecedented times. However, as in much of the world, challenges remain. Brazil is navigating an exchange rate in flux, a rise in inflation, and economic inequality exacerbated by the pandemic. Minister Guedes entered office with a commitment to open Brazil's economy and increase the ease of doing business, proposing long-needed structural reforms such as the approved pension reform and the ongoing administrative and tax reforms. As the second largest economy in the Western Hemisphere, the decisions taken today to guide Brazil's economy will shape the future of both Brazil and the hemisphere. As finance ministers meet in Washington this week to discuss the economic repercussions and solutions to this pandemic, today's conversation, in partnership with our Geoeconomic Center, will shed light on the thinking behind Brazil's economic outlook amid COVID and beyond. We invite you to follow along on Twitter using the hashtag #ACBrazil. And with that, I'd like to welcome Brazil's Minister of the Economy, Paulo Guedes. Minister Guedes was appointed in 2019 by President Bolsonaro to lead the country's economy. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago and was a professor at several institutions in Brazil. Minister Guedes, thank you so much for being with us to share your insights over the course of this next half hour. We're also delighted to be joined by our in-studio audience by Brazil's ambassador here, Nestor Forster. We have a lot to cover, Mr. Guedes, over the course of these next few minutes, from the annual meetings to the economic impact of COVID, to the economic outlook, U.S. Brazil ties, technology. So we have a full plate looking ahead. But I want to begin with the annual meetings occurring just down the street and looking at the implications of those meetings. I want to begin by asking for you, what are some of the key takeaways in which the World Bank and IMF can better support Brazil and the region to be better positioned as we look at this continued economic recovery from the COVID pandemic?
Nice meeting you again, Jason. Well, the first message is the concern about the COVID, the pandemic. So the first concern of everybody in that room when we began was talking exactly about mass vaccination, the need to advance in the war against the pandemic. And the message I brought from Brazil was exactly that we vaccinated 93% of our adult population with the first doses and 60% fully vaccinated with 2 doses. So we are experiencing a safe return to work. So sectors like commerce and services that are still, I see Washington, the city is kind of empty, it's scary. So Brazil streets are
a little less empty now than it was previously, but still not to the pre-pandemic levels.
Yes. So we feel the difference, and it's concerning. But then what happened with us? Brazil GDP dropped less than half of the IMF estimate. The IMF estimated that Brazil would drop 9.7% in 2020, and that UK advanced economies like the U.S., everybody would drop like 4%. What actually happened is that countries like Spain dropped more than 10%, UK dropped more than 9%, Italy dropped more than 8%, France more than 7%, Germany 5.6%, Japan 4.5%, and Brazil dropped 4%. And because of our job preservation programs, we preserved 1/3 of the private sector labor market, we preserved, it's about 33 million people. We preserved 11 million jobs, so 1/3. And we created 3 million, 10% of this labor pool. We created from bottom and half of last year to now. So we really had an interesting performance in the sense that we dropped less, we recovered faster, and we are growing above the average of the advanced economies, not only the Latin American economies, the Euro area economies, but also the advanced economies. We are growing faster. This year we should be growing 5.3%.
Mr., I want to go into talking about Brazil's economic growth, looking at some of the programs that Brazil had to deal with in the midst of the pandemic. But just going back to the IMF and World Bank, you mentioned that vaccinations is top.
Vaccination was the first topic.
What are some of the other ways in which both institutions can better support both Brazil and the region in its COVID recovery?
Well, a second concern is exactly the uneven and unequal recovery. Certain countries, exactly because they don't have access to vaccination, they're suffering more. So there was a big concern with that. And in my speech, I said that Brazil, as soon as we get 2 months more, we'll have the whole adult population fully vaccinated. Mm-hmm. We'll begin vaccinating our neighbors. So we will help our neighbors. So this was a big concern. First one, vaccination. Number two, the unequal recovery because certain sectors, imagine certain islands in the Caribbean that used to live from tourism. And then tourism is a service industry that just collapsed.
The Caribbean's been devastated.
And it has been devastated. And these people need help. They need the vaccines and they need to restart the services. So this was a second very important topic, the inequality, and not only in access to vaccines, but also in the recovery perspectives. The third one was climate change. Climate change is something really that everybody's concerned about that because calamities like it's happening now. It's raining too little in Brazil, and then energy is going up because we use hydroelectric power. And at the same time, it's raining too much in China. And then they run on coal. And then the price of coal is exploding in China. So raining too much in China, too little in Brazil. So these climate disturbances is also a concern of the forum.
Potentially an opportunity to work together on green and equitable economic growth. In Brazil, COVID has many important advances taken. At the same time, COVID has deepened a number of the pre-existing inequalities and social economic inequalities that we see in countries all around the world. This is not necessarily specific to Brazil. In the case of Brazil, much monetary assistance provided by the government and continued social programs, but still challenges with poverty rates, unemployment, and inflation. From your perspective, what is the best way to address economic inequalities? Again, many long-standing inequalities, some of which have been further exacerbated by the pandemic.
Direct income transfers. The pandemic just reinforced our perception. Milton Friedman from Chicago University also said, if you want to help the poor, don't create a lot of institutions to help the poor because the money doesn't get there. If you want to help them, just make a voucher, a direct income transfer to them, and let them make their choices. And of course, we must invest in education, social care, taking care of kids. Also, James Heckman, another very good economist from Chicago, also Nobel Prize. The sooner you invest in the human beings, the better the quality of their lives, the better the education perspectives, the brighter life they can have. So taking care of the kids as soon as they are born, to the first 7 years when the cognitive
pivotal first years.
Yes, so it's critical. So he won the Nobel Prize talking about this. So it's very interesting because in 2020, it was the most important reduction in poverty in the last 40 years. It was a side effect of fighting against the COVID. We created a direct income transfer to poor people. We digitalized 68 million people 40 million were the invisible ones, people who worked in the informal market, informal job market. And another 28 million people who used the social assistance programs in Brazil. So we digitalized the 68 million people, and we made these direct income transfers around $100 a month.
Yeah.
So it was a fabulous impact, fabulous impact. We spent like 10% of GDP. Brazil spent twice as much as the average of the emerging economies, and 10% more than the average of the advanced economies. We really spent a lot of money providing social assistance. And the result was formidable because it really was the largest impact on poverty that we ever had. But of course, because it was calibrated at a high level, we began watching increasing prices in sector prices like housing and food and housing. Well, as soon as these price increases, supposedly temporary, and sector price increases began manifesting themselves, we then approved fiscal triggers to blockade other expenditures not related to health, and we approved the independence of the central bank. So to prevent temporary health expenditures to become price increases to become permanent and generalized inflation. But anyhow, inflation went higher. All over the world, half of inflation is food and energy. So inflation in the U.S. used to be 0, is now around 5% CPI. In Brazil, used to be 4, is now 9%. So it's like a delta of 5% all over the world.
Now, Minister, I want to get into, as we're starting to talk about the data on the economic outlook. There's recent data actually published just this week from the IMF on Brazil's economy, which the IMF predicts is going to grow by 5.2% this year, but then by only 1.5% in 2022. That's at odds with your predictions of about 5.5% in 2021. How do you explain this discrepancy in projections between your perspectives on the economy?
Well, it happened before. The IMF went to Brazil. I told you they're going to make a mistake again. They'll keep doing it. They went to Brazil last year and they forecasted a drop of 9.7 to Brazil. And I told the mission, listen guys, you were quite wrong. Brazil will drop much less than that and we recover fast. And we knew what we were doing. We released credit programs, direct income transfer programs, job preservation programs. It was the first time. In 2015, we had a self-imposed recession. We destroyed 1.5 million jobs. In 16, another drop of 3.5% of GDP, and we destroyed another 1.4 million jobs. So 3 million jobs in 2 years. This time, it was a recession that came from abroad with the COVID. The GDP drop was even larger. It was 4%, not 3.5, but 4%. We created 100,000 jobs. So we didn't lose jobs. We didn't lose jobs. Because of our job preservation programs. We told the restaurants, small companies, we said, listen, instead of just firing your employee, pay half of the wage, we pay the other half. And you keep it working just 2 hours or home office, whatever. But keep him in the job and we pay for it. So it was amazing. We preserved 11 million jobs and we created another 3 million jobs now. And so just to go to the point of the forecast, one of the lessons in economics is that when you have a lot of uncertainty and shocks, unexpected shocks, the stability of the forecasters' models is entirely lost. So when the IMF went to Brazil, he said, you're going to make a big mistake. And they forecast 9.7. And it was 4.1. This year they get back there and they say, next year is going to be 1%. I said, you're going to make it again. You're going to lose it again. So it's going to be at least the double. More than 2%. We have already contracts of $100 billion. In the last 2 years, we sold 26 airports, seaport terminals. We are unlocking value all over because we are changing the regulatory framework. So as soon as we change the natural gas regulatory framework, immediately $10 billion were committed of investment for the next 2, 3, 4 years. Immediately. We privatized the big sanitation company in Brazil. Same thing we are doing with oil concessions, selling airports, selling sea terminals, railroads. So Brazil is probably the largest investment frontier in the world. Brazil is open for business.
And Minister, that you're getting to my question is then what must be done to accelerate that growth in the coming years? You mentioned structural reforms, privatizations. From your perspective, what else should be on the agenda to get to these higher economic growth?
We are following, Brazil wants to be a strong market economy, a market economy. The government is retrenching. The idea is exactly to control public expenditures. It's the first government in history that when we took over, the federal government was spending 19.7% of GDP. With the pandemic, we went to 26.5% in 2020. 21, we are back to 19.5%, and next year 17.5%. So it's the first government in Brazilian history that will be spending less in the last year than in the first year.
Yeah.
So most governments increase their expenditures all the time. We are doing the other way around. We are privatizing, we are changing the regulatory framework, we are opening for private investment. It's a huge crowding in because we will be reducing corporate taxes, we'll be opening the economy. We just agreed with Mercosul that we will begin reducing tariffs to increase productivity and efficiency. So we'll follow our program. We kept our structural reforms during the disease, so we are really trying to follow our program. Of course, we suffered a lot. Our debt GDP ratio was also forecasted by a lot of economists to reach 100% of GDP because it was 76 when we got there, 76.5 debt GDP ratio. When the COVID began, they said, well, it's going to be 100% of GDP. Well, it's 81%.
And Minister, you mentioned the importance of opening Brazil, right, and showing that Brazil is open for business, increasing the ease of doing business. This has been one of your priorities from the outside as Minister. You mentioned the structural reforms, including the pension reform approved in Congress a couple years ago, the administrative and tax reforms which are currently in discussion in Congress. Yes. I'd like for you to share a little bit what your perspective on the benefits of these reforms, and when can we also expect some of these reforms, the administrative and tax reforms currently in Congress, when could we expect those to potentially be concluded?
I think by the end of the year, you'll have the tax reform approved. I think we'll have the confirmation of two very important privatizations like the Postal Service and the largest energy company in Brazil, which is Eletrobras. As a matter of fact, largest energy company in Latin America. A huge company. It will be also privatized. The tax reform, the administrative reform. I think we'll see all that before the end of the year. I think the Brazilian democracy keeps surprising. It's very noisy. It's a very vibrant democracy. So it's a lot of noise. You can listen it from here. There's all the time noise, lots of stones thrown from one side to the other, but it's all in the democratic rules. It was an alliance of liberals and conservatives that won after 30 years of left government, left-leaned government. So it's pretty natural.
Now we're here in Washington. You're here, of course, for the IMF World Bank meetings, but also the importance of U.S. Brazil economic ties is something that we worked on for quite some time here at the Atlantic Council, the Adrian Arch Latin America Center report last year on Brazilian trade and FDI helped to lead to some of the trade rules and that were eventually signed between the two countries. In your view, in your optimal scenario, what are some of the next steps that can be taken to strengthen U.S.-Brazil economic ties? And also, what additional steps are you looking at to further accelerate U.S. investment into Brazil?
Well, we've been talking to you. It's unfortunately the COVID suspended our physical conversations, but we always keep talking to you and working with you. So from the very beginning, we received support to go to the OECD. Americans were giving us support. So I think it will be renewed in spite of the change of the administration. We hope we'll get help. I had a long conversation with Mr. Yellen, a long conversation with the President Matias of OECD. Everybody understands that Brazil stands where he belongs. If we are on the other side, we can help very much. If we have access to OCDE, We can help on convergences. For instance, historical tax agreement, international agreement, was closed on this Friday with minimum corporate tax all over the world. We are reducing our corporate taxes from 34% to 26%, so we are trying to reduce corporate taxes in the direction of the rest of the world. We are digitalizing. Brazil was elected by in the ranking of the World Bank, the number one in the Americas in digital services, ahead of Canada and ahead of the U.S. 115 million Brazilians can retire through the Social Security digitalized services. You can receive your driver's license. You can receive transfer payments. You can pay your taxes. Everything digitalized. 115 million Brazilians using digital services. The World Bank classified Brazil in 7th place in the world and 1st place in Americas. So I think we are doing our homework. We are working very hard and talking to the Americans. Yesterday I spent the whole afternoon with a group of American businessmen here in Washington, and we were talking about defense, medical care, logistics, natural gas, oil, railroads, really people willing to invest in Brazil. Brazil is the 4th largest receiver of foreign investments. 1 and 2, China and the U.S. Number 3 is Singapore, because Singapore is just a hub. Money flows in, so a lot of money flows in, but flows out.
Yeah.
The investment is not there. So Brazil is really the 3rd largest investment receiver in the world. And we are open for business. So we are really very confident that we will grow twice as much the IMF is forecasting. We dropped half as much as they forecasted. And why are they making such big mistakes? Because of the noise, the political noise. The noise is so overwhelming here that we are burning forests, that we are not vaccinating population. We vaccinated more people as a percentage of adult population than the U.S.
Yeah.
But the noise here is Brazil does not vaccinate its population. Brazil is not growing. Brazil will drop more than the advanced economy. It's pure noise, a lot of noise. It is a democracy, very vibrant. And the losers keep shouting, and we keep working.
So I want to look ahead. Watching us today are government as well as industry leaders with a keen interest in Brazil's economic development. And I'd like to ask for what message you'd like to impart to them about the future trajectory of Brazil's economy, especially, you bring up political, but especially with presidential elections that are set to take place next October.
Well, the first thing I would say is trust Brazilian democracy. Have confidence on our institutional process. Sometimes one here, one there, might be the president, might be a congressman, might be minister of the Supreme Court. Sometimes someone is making a lot of noise, but the important thing is the institutions. The institutions work. Our institutions work. Brazil is a vibrant democracy. We are voting every 2 years. We went twice to hyperinflation. We now face it, COVID, and our institutions work. Elections will happen. The institutional framework is improving all the time. You see, during the pandemics, we approved an independent central bank, fiscal triggers to guarantee that the fiscal fundamentals are in place, the privatization of postal service and a huge energy generation company, the bankruptcy law to help these companies that collapse to wake up and walk again. We are approving the natural gas framework, the sanitation framework. So we are advancing. So my word would be trust Brazil, especially in this moment of geolocation, deciding after COVID, a lot of companies are changing their geo-industrial location, their position out of China into South America. So think of Brazil. We are reducing corporate tax. We made all the structural reforms we need. We are reducing corporate tax. We are reducing barriers to trade. We are opening the economy. So we are simplifying to open a company in Brazil. It's a pity that there was a problem with the ease of doing business and the World Bank, because Brazil would advance 30 or 40 positions. It used to take like 6 months to open a company in Brazil, and you would have to talk to 4 or 5 governmental agencies. Now you open in 3 days, digital. Your company. So you open your company, you begin working, and you have 6, 8 months to notify one of those 5, 6 agencies.
And digital transformation is so important. There are so many other questions to get into on that, but unfortunately we're out of time. I want to thank you, Minister Guedes, for your insight, your comments, your outlook, and your ability to cover so much ground in such a short period of time. I want to now turn to the Assistant Director of the Agent Orange Latin America Center, our Brazil lead, Valentina Sader, to give us some closing comments. Valentina?
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Minister Guedes, once again for joining us today. Clearly, from today's conversation, Brazil, Latin America, and the world still have a long way toward full economic recovery post-COVID-19. Minister Guedes laid out a number of policies today that will hopefully accelerate Brazil's continued economic recovery and resolve economic challenges exacerbated by the pandemic. This is a time to prioritize reforms and policies that will modernize the Brazilian economy, foster innovation, further attract investment, and set the vision for a prosperous future for Brazil and its population. At the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, our work is driven by the fact that economic opportunities can and should be inclusive for all Brazilians. Economic growth is fundamental to Brazil's overall prosperity, but also to benefit the lives of its people. And our work aims to advance that. We are optimistic about this momentum, and we will continue to focus on how we can advance shared opportunities for collaboration and cooperation between the United States and Brazil. Thank you for joining us today, and have a good evening.